Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. When you're trying to diagnose a problem with a car engine, the process is, it's incredibly linear. You plug in a diagnostic tool, it reads a code, and it tells you exactly which valve is misfiring.
Right. You just replace the part, the engine runs, and everyone goes home happy.
Exactly. It's a system built on, visible mechanical certainty. But then you step into the realm of human organizations. You step into nonprofits, corporate teams, and specifically trauma and addiction recovery.
And suddenly you aren't looking at a mechanical engine anymore, are you?
No, not at all. You are looking at a living, breathing ecosystem. And diagnosing a failure in an ecosystem is entirely different. I mean, the codes aren't clear. The failures are often totally invisible to the people running the system.
Because they're just too close to it, usually.
Yeah, and the solutions require completely rethinking how that entire ecosystem is governed. So, welcome everyone to today's deep dive. We are so glad you are here with us.
We really are.
Now, whether you are managing a corporate team or serving on the board of a nonprofit, or maybe you're just someone trying to understand the invisible forces shaping your community, today's deep dive provides a rigorous, data-backed blueprint.
And it's a blueprint for making organizations genuinely equitable, not just, welcoming on a glossy brochure, but equitable in actual practice.
And we are unpacking a truly fascinating piece of research to do that, really fascinating. We are looking at Dr. David Morrow's 2022 dissertation.
Right, titled The Principles of Servant Leadership as a Tool for Navigating Racial Inequity, an Organizational Analysis.
It's a mouthful, but it's brilliant.
It really is. And this research was actually presented to the International Higher Institute for Leadership in France and the Thierry Graduate School of Leadership in Belgium.
So to lay the groundwork for you, the mission of our deep dive today is to explore a stunning racial disparity, one that was uncovered inside the recovery programs of a 120-year-old Christian nonprofit.
Specifically, Union Gospel Mission Twin Cities, or UGMTC.
Right. And we're going to examine how Dr. Morrow used a very specific organizational framework called servant leadership to basically diagnose why this disparity existed.
And not just diagnose it, but how to navigate it, and ultimately how to dismantle those systemic inequalities from the inside out.
Let's start with how this all kicked off, because the origin of this research really starts with what Dr. Morrow describes as a light bulb moment.
Yeah, and it's a narrative that I think anyone who has spent time on the ground floor of a large organization is going to understand immediately.
Oh, absolutely. So he had been working at Union Gospel Mission Twin Cities for nearly 6 years. And interestingly, his original life plan was to go to seminary.
Right. He was going to move straight into a PhD in theology and biblical studies. He pictured a quiet life in academia.
But he found himself drawn instead to working directly with individuals living on the absolute margins of the cultural landscape.
He was on the literal front lines of human crisis.
Yeah, and because of the nature of his role at the organization, his daily schedule was sort of split right down the middle. So he spent his mornings doing intake at the emergency shelter.
Which is essentially the triage desk.
Exactly. He is the first face welcoming men who are stepping in off the streets of St. Paul and Minneapolis. Men needing the most basic survival necessities: food, a bed, clothing, safety.
And during those morning shifts, the demographic reality of the city was just right in front of him. He was welcoming a highly diverse group of men.
Right. It was roughly a 50-50 split of black and white individuals coming through those emergency doors every single morning.
But the disconnect, that light bulb moment, it happened in the afternoons.
Yeah. Tell us about the afternoons.
So every 6 weeks, the organization's staff would be invited to graduation ceremonies. They called them launch parties for the intensive long-term recovery programs.
And these are beautiful moments, right? I mean, They're celebrations of men who have done the grueling, painful work of pursuing healing and sobriety.
They are incredibly emotional. But as Morrow sat in these ceremonies month after month, year after year, this jarring discontinuity started to really bother him.
Because the math wasn't mathing.
Exactly. He would spend his morning welcoming, let's say, a group of 10 new men into the emergency shelter, and 5 of them were black.
50-50.
Right. But then he would sit in the graduation ceremony that same afternoon, applauding a group of men who had successfully completed the intensive recovery programs, and almost every single graduate crossing the stage was white.
Which is just, he describes this escalating feeling. It started as curiosity, morphed into confusion, and eventually settled into a really deep frustration.
Because you can't see that happen repeatedly and not ask why.
Right. But he knew he couldn't just rely on an anecdotal feeling. If you're going to approach an executive board about a systemic issue, you need a larger sample size than just your own memory.
You need the hard receipts.
You need the receipts. So he went into the archives and pulled the hard organizational data spanning a massive 15-year period from 2005 to 2019.
And the numbers validated his exact fears. The data showed that over those 15 years, the emergency shelter population, the starting line of the pipeline, basically remained highly diverse.
It hovered right around 45% Black and 45% white.
Right. But the mission operates two main full-time recovery programs, the Discipleship Program and the Christ Recovery Center, which we'll refer to as CRC.
And keep in mind, these are two programs operating under the exact same organizational roof. They're funded by the same donors, overseen by the exact same executive board.
Precisely. But the demographic outcomes of these two programs were just worlds apart. When Morrow looked at the graduates of the discipleship program, the demographics were 56% white and 44% people of color.
Okay, so that roughly mirrors the population coming through the front doors of the emergency shelter.
Yes. In the discipleship program, the pipeline seemed to be functioning equitably.
But then he looked at the Christ Recovery Center, the CRC.
The graduates of the Christ Recovery Center over that same 15-year period were 89% white and only 11% people of color.
89%. I mean, let's make this abstract data concrete for you listening. Think about a university that sends out a glossy brochure boasting about its incredibly diverse 50-50 freshman class.
Right. They take the photos on the quad. Everyone is celebrating the equity of their admissions process.
Exactly. But by graduation day, 4 years later, you look at the stage and realize that half the student body hit some sort of invisible wall.
An invisible wall that the other half of the students didn't even know was there.
Right. The graduating class looks absolutely nothing like the freshman class. If you're looking at that data, the immediate question is, how does an organization that genuinely wants to help people, an organization founded in 1902 to literally save lives, end up with such a heavily skewed outcome?
It forces us to ask what is happening inside the walls of that specific program, because both programs share the ultimate goal of restoring human dignity and wholeness.
Right. They're both trying to do good.
Yes, yet the data objectively shows that the CRC is effectively, though entirely unintentionally, filtering out Black participants.
And to understand why this was happening, Dr. Morrow didn't just want to, point fingers. He needed a diagnostic lens.
He hypothesized that a specific organizational theory called servant leadership could actually explain the gap.
He believed those principles would not only explain why the discipleship program was succeeding with a diverse population, but that those same principles could serve as the architectural blueprint to fix the CRC.
Which means, before we can really understand how these programs are functioning, we have to deeply understand the diagnostic tool itself.
Yeah, because we hear the phrase servant leadership thrown around a lot, like in corporate seminars, on LinkedIn. It's often used as just a buzzword for, being a nice boss.
Right, giving people Fridays off or buying donuts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the context of organizational psychology, it is a highly specific, measurable metric. So where does this framework actually come from?
Well, the modern framework is most frequently attributed to a man named Robert Greenleaf. In 1970, Greenleaf published a seminal essay called The Servant as Leader.
And what's fascinating about Greenleaf is his background. He wasn't some philosopher locked in an ivory tower, right?
Not at all. He spent 40 years as an executive at AT&T, researching management and organizational behavior during the height of the mid-century corporate boom.
But his inspiration for this theory didn't come from a boardroom. It came from literature.
Yes, specifically a 1932 short novel by Hermann Hesse called Journey to the East.
It's such a striking origin story. So the book is about a group of men who belong to a secret order, and they set out on a mythical pilgrimage to the East.
Right. And accompanying them on this journey is a servant named Leo.
And Leo is there to carry the bags and do the menial chores for the group, right?
Yes, but he does much more than that. He actually sustains the group with his spirit, his quiet presence, and his songs. He is the emotional anchor of the party.
But midway through the journey, Leo suddenly disappears.
And the moment the servant is gone, the entire group falls into disarray. The men begin arguing, the group completely fractures, and the journey is abandoned.
They realize, way too late, that they cannot function without him.
And the revelation comes years later. The narrator of the story eventually finds Leo, only to discover that Leo was never just a servant.
He was actually the titular head of the order that sponsored the entire journey.
Exactly. He was the great noble leader all along, but he chose to lead by taking the posture of the lowest servant.
And Greenleaf took that narrative and built a radical organizational theory around it. He argued that the desire to serve must supersede the desire to lead.
In servant leadership, leading is almost an afterthought. It is merely a byproduct of serving.
And Greenleaf established a very specific, uncompromising barometer to measure if an organization was actually practicing this.
He asked 2 questions. First, do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous?
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second?
The second crucial question is, what is the effect on the least privileged in society? Will they benefit, or at least not be further deprived?
Wow. That second question completely changes the game.
It really does.
Because the core metric of success isn't revenue, it isn't efficiency, it's the well-being of the most marginalized person in the room.
Right. If the leadership structure works for the majority, but further deprives the least privileged, it fundamentally fails the test of servant leadership.
To truly grasp how radical this is, we have to contrast it with the dominant leadership models of the time. Like, think about transformational leadership.
Oh, absolutely. A theory developed by James McGregor Burns and Bernard Bass, which became the absolute golden standard in the 80s and 90s.
And transformational leadership is all about a charismatic leader inspiring followers to transcend their own self-interests, right?
Yes, for the good of the organization. The ultimate goal is the success of the company or the mission.
So, in transformational leadership, the leader lifts you up so that you can help the company win.
Exactly. Or consider authentic leadership, which focuses heavily on the leader's internal moral compass and transparency, being true to oneself.
But servant leadership completely inverts the traditional organizational chart. The ultimate goal is not the company's output.
No, the goal is the follower's holistic growth. The organization is just a vehicle to serve the individual.
Okay, I have to jump in and play devil's advocate here for a second, specifically regarding the terminology used in the modern research.
Go for it.
Because Dr. Morrow's work relies on the research of Sanjaya, who operationalized Greenleaf's philosophy into 6 measurable dimensions.
Yes, Sanjaya's framework is critical here.
And the very first dimension is called voluntary subordination. I'm looking at that phrase, and it feels deeply counterintuitive.
In what way?
Well, in a high-stakes environment like addiction recovery, you are dealing with life and death. The stakes couldn't be higher. Don't people in crisis need a strong, authoritative, unshakable leader to pull them out of the chaos, rather than a leader who willingly subordinates themselves to the patient?
That's a very fair point.
Doesn't subordination imply, like, a total lack of control?
It is a vital question, and honestly, it is the most common critique of the model.
Yeah.
But we have to understand what voluntary subordination actually means in practice.
Okay, unpack that.
It is not weakness. It is not a lack of boundaries or a leader letting the inmates run the asylum, so to speak. It is a deliberate, highly disciplined choice to flatten the power dynamic.
Flattening the power dynamic.
Okay. Sanjaya roots this concept historically in the model of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. In that historical narrative, Jesus holds all the positional authority in the room, yet he intentionally takes the physical posture of the lowest servant.
Right.
Voluntary subordination is the willingness to relinquish your own privileges, rights, and status to serve the needs of the other person.
So it's an active choice, not a passive failing.
Precisely. And if you think about an addiction recovery setting, many individuals entering these programs have profound histories of trauma.
Oh, definitely. They have been broken by authoritarian systems, by the criminal justice system, by abusive family dynamics.
So, if a recovery leader walks into the room radiating traditional top-down authority, the patient's trauma response is going to immediately flare up. Their walls go up.
But by flattening the power dynamic through voluntary subordination, the leader removes the threat.
Yes. They create a psychological container where trust can finally replace fear.
That reframes it completely. If you are operating at eye level, the person can actually breathe. So voluntary subordination is the first dimension. What are the other 5 dimensions that Sanjaya established?
Because we really need to understand exactly what Morrow was looking for when he analyzed these 2 programs.
Exactly.
The second dimension is authentic self. And this goes way beyond just being honest. It is a continuous, vulnerable commitment to be accountable.
So dropping the professional mask.
Right. A leader displaying authentic self doesn't hide behind a professional veneer. They freely admit when they don't know the answer.
I love that. What's the third?
The third is covenantal relationship.
How does that differ from just, a standard professional relationship?
Well, a standard professional relationship in a clinical setting is usually contractual. If you break the rules of the contract, the relationship is terminated.
You fail a drug test, you're out.
Exactly. But a covenantal relationship is a profound, perpetual bond based on mutual trust and unqualified acceptance.
That sounds intense.
It is. It means the leader communicates. You might fail this program, but your failure will not change my fundamental commitment to your dignity.
Wow. Okay, that's powerful. What about the fourth?
The fourth dimension is responsible morality, which is the capacity to engage others in deep moral reasoning, ensuring that both the ends and the means of the recovery process are strictly ethical.
Okay, so it's not just blindly following the rules, it's actually understanding the why behind the rules.
Yes. The fifth is transcendental spirituality. Now, this isn't necessarily about enforcing a specific religion, but rather fostering a sense of interconnectedness.
Helping the individual see the bigger picture.
Right, helping them see that their life has meaning entirely beyond their immediate circumstances or their addiction.
And the final dimension.
The sixth dimension is transforming influence. This is the ripple effect.
The ripple effect.
A true servant leader transforms the follower so profoundly that the follower naturally desires to become a servant leader to someone else.
That is a massive framework. So armed with these 6 dimensions, this incredibly robust diagnostic tool, Dr. Morrow turned his attention back to the Union Gospel mission.
He needed to look at the daily operational realities of the discipleship program and the CRC.
To see why one fostered these dimensions effectively for everyone, and why the other seemed to fail Black participants specifically.
And this brings us to the profound impact of cultural baggage and programmatic mismatches. Let's break down the actual daily mechanics of these two programs.
They operate very differently, right?
Very differently. The discipleship program is designed for men experiencing homelessness and poverty, where acute substance abuse isn't recognized as the primary immediate barrier.
So what do their days look like?
Their days are structured heavily around work therapy, giving them tangible skills and responsibilities. They attend the LifeNet education program, which helps men brush up on academic skills, build resumes, or study for a GED.
And because it's a Christian mission, there is direct Bible study.
Correct. So the focus is heavily on practical life reconstruction and direct theological study.
Okay, now contrast that with the Christ Recovery Center, the CRC.
The CRC is a clinical intensive program focused specifically on chronic severe substance abuse. And the entire architecture of the CRC program is built upon the Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, 12-step model.
And to give you a sense of the density of that, out of the 17 formal meetings scheduled for the men every single week, 13 of them are strictly AA Big Book meetings.
13 out of 17.
And this detail is the hinge upon which this entire organizational mystery turns. We have to pause here and talk about the history of AA.
We really do.
Because to be clear, the 12-step model has saved countless millions of lives. It is unarguably one of the most effective public health interventions of the 20th century.
Without a doubt.
But we cannot look at the CRC program without looking at the cultural origins of its primary textbook.
Exactly. The foundational text, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, was written in the late 1930s. It was authored primarily by two men, Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, two middle-class, middle-aged white men.
And their early support network, the Oxford Group, was also overwhelmingly white and culturally homogenous.
Now, the principles of surrender, inventory, and making amends are universally powerful. But the language, the cultural assumptions, the storytelling framework, and the implicit social codes woven into that book, they reflect the specific worldview of 1930s white America.
And the research highlights this brilliantly. It points to a specific piece of literature published by AA World Services in 2001, an informational pamphlet explicitly aimed at Black and African American alcoholics.
What is so striking is that AA itself openly acknowledges this historical friction in that pamphlet.
Right. The pamphlet details the stories of early Black members who walked into all-white AA spaces and felt an immediate crushing awkwardness.
They felt that the cultural norms of the room simply didn't understand their lived experience.
Think about it like a hospital relying on an incredibly effective instruction manual for a life-saving procedure. The medical science in the manual is flawless. It works.
Good.
But the manual is written in a very obscure, highly specific regional dialect. If you're a doctor who natively speaks that dialect, you just read the steps and do the surgery.
It's seamless for you.
But if you don't speak that dialect, you have to spend half your cognitive energy just translating the idioms, parsing the syntax, and guessing the cultural context before you can even pick up the scalpel.
That analogy perfectly captures the cognitive load.
Right. The CRC program was essentially asking Black participants to do the grueling, exhausting work of addiction recovery while simultaneously forcing them to act as cultural translators.
You are already fighting for your life against a chemical dependency, and now you have to perform a cultural assimilation just to participate in the group therapy.
And the research backs up why this is so detrimental. Dr. Morrow cites a major 2011 meta-analysis by Cabral and Smith.
Yes, they looked at the concept of ethnic matching in therapeutic settings.
What does that mean practically for our listeners?
It means matching the racial or ethnic background of the client with the therapist or counselor.
Okay.
Cabral and Smith analyzed vast amounts of clinical data and found that while ethnic matching is generally beneficial across the board, it is highly beneficial and in many cases clinically critical for the therapeutic success of Black participants.
Why is that?
Because having a counselor who implicitly understands your cultural background without requiring you to explain it accelerates the trust-building process immensely.
Yet, when Morrow looked at the staffing of the Christ Recovery Center at the time of this study, it was overwhelmingly white.
There were 6 white staff members and only 1 Black staff member.
And crucially, the 2 primary intake staff, the literal gatekeepers of the program, were both white.
Meanwhile, the discipleship program, which we know had equitable graduation rates, had a much more balanced staff. 3 white staff members and 2 Black staff members.
But the cultural mismatch went even deeper than staffing. The dissertation highlights a fascinating theological and denominational divide that exacerbated the friction in the CRC program.
This part of the research blew my mind because it shows how deeply embedded our cultural assumptions are.
Let's get into it.
Historically, in the United States, white Christian participants often come from Catholic or Lutheran backgrounds. Those specific theological traditions place a heavy emphasis on balancing institutional church tradition alongside Scripture.
So they are comfortable with rituals, established liturgy, and historical precedents.
Right, and that specific religious mindset meshes seamlessly with the AA model, which relies heavily on the 12 traditions of AA alongside the text of the Big Book. It feels familiar to them.
But Black participants in the United States historically often come from Baptist, Methodist, or Pentecostal backgrounds.
Yes, and generally speaking, those traditions place a much stronger, sometimes exclusive, focus on the direct authority of Scripture rather than institutional traditions.
Okay, I see where this is going.
So when a Black participant entered the discipleship program, which relies directly on Bible study without the added rigid layer of the AA traditions, it naturally aligned with the spiritual framework they already understood.
But when that same participant entered the CRC, they were met with a rigid adherence to AA traditions that felt foreign.
Exactly. The CRC required a cultural and spiritual translation that the discipleship program simply didn't demand.
And we cannot ignore the fact that these internal organizational frictions were not happening in a vacuum.
No, context is everything.
Right. The deep dive into this research requires us to look at the timeline. Dr. Morrow was conducting this research during a period of profound societal tension in the Twin Cities.
This was happening in the direct aftermath of high-profile police shootings, with massive protests occurring in the streets right outside the mission's walls.
And that tension inevitably bled into the recovery rooms. We have to report on this impartially because it's what was happening in the space.
It did, and as an organizational researcher, Morrow had to document how that external environment impacted the internal culture.
What did he find?
He recorded a qualitative interview with a Black student in the CRC program who described a specific incident during those protests. According to the student, a white CRC participant made a comment in the communal space expressing a desire to run the protesters down with a vehicle.
Wow. When you are in a recovery program, the absolute baseline requirement for success is psychological safety.
You have to be able to be completely vulnerable.
You have to expose your deepest flaws to the group. When a Black participant hears a comment like that from a peer in what is supposed to be a safe space, it instantly shatters that psychological container.
It completely destroys it. And Morrow recorded that data point not to editorialize the politics, but to objectively document the specific environmental barriers Black students were citing as reasons they could not feel safe in the CRC program.
But if you are the board of directors of Union Gospel Mission, anecdotes and historical context, while powerful, are not enough to completely re-engineer a multi-million-dollar program.
No, you can't just say the history of AA is culturally specific, so we need to change everything. You need empirical proof.
You need to prove that this historical friction is actually manifesting in the present-day leadership culture. So Dr. Morrow had to figure out how to measure an invisible dynamic.
Which brings us to the quantitative data.
How did he actually measure this? Because measuring servant leadership sounds like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands.
This is where Sanjaya's diagnostic tools come back into play. Sanjaya developed the Servant Leadership Behavior Scales, or SLBS.
Okay, what does that look like?
There is a short form, the SLBS-6, and a comprehensive long form, the SLBS-35, which contains 35 highly specific statements. Morrow deployed these surveys to both the staff and the students across both programs.
So he is asking the men living in the programs to quantitatively rate the leadership they're experiencing every single day.
Exactly. And the aggregated results were illuminating. Across the board, on almost every metric, the discipleship program scored higher in servant leadership than the Christ Recovery Center.
By how much?
When you average the scores out, the discipleship program staff were rated about 5.2% higher in their demonstration of servant leadership behaviors.
Okay, I have to stop you there. Because if I'm a corporate manager listening to this and HR tells me that Team A's leadership score is 5.2% higher than Team B's, I am probably going to shrug.
You think it's insignificant?
Yeah, a 5% margin sounds like statistical noise. It doesn't sound like a catastrophic organizational failure. Can a 5% shift in how leadership is perceived really be the definitive cause of an 89% versus 56% difference in racial graduation rates?
It's a brilliant question, and it requires us to understand how organizational culture functions at a systemic level. You can't think of that 5% as a test score.
How should I think of it?
You have to think of it like an environmental baseline. Think about temperature. A 5% difference in baseline trust and safety is the exact difference between water being at 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 37 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, walk me through that analogy.
At 32 degrees, water is ice.
Mm.
It is structurally rigid. If you hit it, it doesn't yield, it pushes back.
Right.
If you don't fit the exact shape of the ice, you are excluded.
Right.
But at 37 degrees, it is liquid, it is malleable, it flows around obstacles, it adapts to the shape of whatever is placed inside it.
That's a staggering way to visualize it.
That 5% shift fundamentally changes the state of matter of the organization. A 5% increase in servant leadership changes an environment from a rigid system that demands assimilation into a malleable environment that adapts to the participant.
So that 5% difference in baseline trust is what allows marginalized participants to finally breathe.
Exactly.
But what is the heat source? What were the discipleship staff actually doing on a Tuesday afternoon that raised that baseline temperature by 5 degrees compared to the CRC staff?
To find the heat source, we have to look at the outliers in the 35-question survey. While the average difference was 5%, there were 10 specific statements on the survey where the discipleship program scored significantly higher, often double the average margin.
The statements where the discipleship staff blew the CRC staff out of the water. Let's look at those.
The discipleship program scored vastly higher on statements like, serves people without regard to their backgrounds, like gender or race.
That's huge.
And critically, minimizes barriers that inhibit my success.
That goes right back to the voluntary subordination dimension we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. The leader's primary job is barrier removal, not rule enforcement.
Exactly. They also scored significantly higher on the statement. Gives me the right to question his or her actions and decisions.
Which maps directly onto the authentic self dimension.
Yes. The data empirically proved that the Black majority discipleship program wasn't just circumstantially different. The staff there actively demonstrated a willingness to be questioned and a commitment to removing barriers.
To put it simply, the men in the discipleship program viewed their staff as partners in their recovery. The men in the CRC viewed their staff as traditional authority figures enforcing a rigid, unyielding system.
That's exactly what the data showed.
So we have the historical context of the AA mismatch. We have the quantitative survey data proving a colder, more rigid leadership culture in the CRC. But statistics can be cold.
They don't tell the human story.
Right. To truly understand the gravity of that 5% difference, to see the human cost of that 32-degree ice, Morrow knew he had to talk to the men living inside the machine.
This is the qualitative phase of the research, and it is arguably the most powerful part of the entire dissertation.
Tell me about the interviews.
Dr. Morrow sat down and conducted 17 in-depth, one-on-one interviews. He spoke with 9 men from the CRC and 8 men from the discipleship program.
And he was careful with the demographics, right?
Very. He matched the racial demographics of the interviewees to the overall historical intake demographics of the emergency shelter, ensuring the sample was representative.
And almost immediately, in the very first phase of these interviews, he uncovered a systemic flaw that I find absolutely heartbreaking. I call it the blind triage flaw.
It is a devastating revelation. Morrow asked the men a very simple question. Why did you choose your specific program?
Because he assumed they had weighed the pros and cons, right? The 12-step model versus the work therapy model.
Exactly. But the responses revealed a massive systemic failure. 100% of the men in the Christ Recovery Center and 75% of the men in the discipleship program stated that they had absolutely no idea the other program even existed when they enrolled.
100% of the CRC participants didn't know they had an option.
They had no idea.
They weren't making an informed choice about their clinical pathway. They were being sorted based on blind referrals.
Yes. White men with addiction issues were being referred to the CRC by their suburban networks, courts, or family members who were familiar with AA.
And Black men with complex needs were being routed to the discipleship program through entirely different community pipelines.
Exactly. Think of it like a triage nurse at a chaotic hospital who is assigning patients to different wings of the building without ever looking at their medical charts or asking about their allergies.
The racial disparity wasn't just happening during the program. It was being baked into the concrete at the very front door.
White men were being routed to a program designed for their cultural comfort, and Black men were being routed to a program that required exhausting cultural translation, and nobody sat them down to explain the difference.
Because the organization's leadership was only looking at the graduation photos at the end of the year. They weren't auditing the plumbing of the pipeline itself.
And once these men were blindly sorted into these programs, their experiences diverged radically. The interviews revealed that their primary sources of encouragement were totally different.
Right. In the Christ Recovery Center, the men reported that they relied almost exclusively on their peers for encouragement.
This is the classic AA brotherhood model, one addict helping another, sharing the burden in the communal room. The staff were viewed merely as administrators.
But in the discipleship program, the men reported relying primarily on the staff for both encouragement and challenge.
Which perfectly aligns with the survey data. The discipleship men viewed the staff as partners engaged in a covenantal relationship.
But here is the most damning metric from the entire dissertation. When Dr. Morrow asked the men directly about their experiences with race and bias inside the walls of the mission,
The numbers are shocking.
80% of the Black men in the Christ Recovery Center reported experiencing overt racism, microaggressions, or unconscious bias.
80%. 4 out of every 5 Black men trying to get sober in that program were simultaneously battling racism.
And what was the number in the discipleship program?
0%. Not a single Black man interviewed in the discipleship program reported experiencing overt racism within the program. 0.
That juxtaposition is the entire dissertation right there.
Yeah.
80 to 0. If you read the direct quotes provided in the text, the psychological toll is just palpable.
It really is. Black men in the CRC described feeling isolated, stating it felt like existing in white America.
One Black student in the CRC explicitly told the researcher, Black is always a hindrance. If not to someone else, to yourself, maybe CRC is just catering to someone that's whiter.
Another participant recounted a story about a Black friend who ended up leaving the recovery program altogether because the cultural friction was so petty and relentless, they wouldn't even let him watch a basketball game on the communal television.
He had to fight for basic cultural space while fighting for his sobriety.
And Morrow didn't just interview the Black men. He asked the white men in the CRC about the racial dynamics, too.
And their responses present a stark, almost textbook contrast.
The white men in the CRC were largely oblivious to the friction. Many explicitly stated that race wasn't an issue or claimed that the program was completely colorblind.
One white CRC student said, I don't see it as a problem. They want it. I don't even look at the color.
How does an organizational researcher interpret that kind of massive cognitive dissonance? How can 80% of one demographic be experiencing racism while the other demographic genuinely believes the room is colorblind?
Morrow utilizes an explanatory framework to understand this, specifically referencing concepts akin to what sociologist Robin DiAngelo terms white fragility, or a lack of racial stamina.
Because the entire CRC environment, the 12-step traditions, the demographics of the staff, the theological framing was built for the cultural comfort of the white participants, they never had to exercise any cultural stamina.
Their environment was completely frictionless.
And because they didn't feel any friction, they assumed the environment was frictionless for everyone else. They literally lacked the organizational lens to see the invisible walls the Black participants were crashing into every single day.
If you are listening to this right now and you manage a team, I want you to pause and think about your own organizational culture. Have you ever looked at an employee engagement survey, seen a dip in morale from a minority demographic, and dismissed it because you feel perfectly comfortable in the office?
It happens all the time.
Morrow's research is screaming at us that the absence of friction for the majority often masks an exhausting 32-degree reality for the marginalized. You won't know the environment is rigid until you ask the people who are being bruised by it.
That is the pivotal transition of this research. Dr. Morrow didn't conduct this analysis just to write a critique. He is a practitioner. He wanted to fix the machinery.
So, armed with the historical context, the empirical survey data, and the devastating qualitative interviews, he created a blueprint.
He asked, how do you re-engineer the Christ Recovery Center for Equity using the 6 dimensions of servant leadership?
Let's walk through those recommendations because this is where the theory becomes actionable.
Yeah.
Let's start with that first dimension, voluntary subordination. The primary recommendation here is to completely demolish the blind triage system at the front door.
Exactly. Morrow recommended radically overhauling the intake process. The organization needed to move away from having 1 or 2 white directors making unilateral, opaque decisions about which program a man enters.
So what replaces that?
The mission needed to create diverse, team-based intake committees. When an applicant walks through the door of the emergency shelter, they shouldn't just be handed a pamphlet. They need to sit down with a diverse committee.
The applicant needs to see faces that look like theirs on day one.
Yes. The committee must explain the cultural and operational differences between the 12-step model and the work therapy model, allowing the applicant to make an informed, autonomous choice about their own recovery.
That is voluntary subordination, giving the power of choice back to the marginalized individual. It flattens the hierarchy before the therapy even begins.
It changes everything.
What about transcendental spirituality? How do you apply that to a program that is so rigidly locked into the AA 12-step model?
The recommendation here is critical. Do not force everyone into the AA box as the only avenue for spiritual connection. AA is a powerful tool, but it is one tool in the toolbox.
So what did Morrow suggest?
He suggested that the CRC integrate culturally diverse spiritual pathways. For example, the mission should actively partner with historically Black churches in the immediate St. Paul and Minneapolis communities.
Provide mission vehicles to transport Black participants to those churches on Sunday mornings.
Right. Allow them to connect with spiritual mentors who understand their cultural dialect. Create alternative, supplementary Bible studies that are not strictly filtered through the lens of the 12 traditions of AA.
Basically, stop making assimilation a prerequisite for sobriety.
Exactly.
I want to look at the authentic self dimension next. Morrow aimed this recommendation squarely at the staff of the Christ Recovery Center. Now, we know that many of the staff in addiction recovery centers are alumni of the programs themselves.
Yes, that's very common.
They are usually incredibly vulnerable about their own addiction stories. Sharing your worst moments is a core part of the recovery model. But Morrow says that isn't enough.
Sharing your past addiction is expected. But Morrow argued that the CRC staff needed to demonstrate vulnerability regarding their current blind spots.
They need to model humility regarding their cultural and racial differences.
It is incredibly powerful for a white recovery leader to sit in a circle and say, I recognize that my experience in the world is different than yours. I do not understand the specific cultural dynamics or the racial exhaustion you are feeling right now. Please teach me and tell me what barriers I can remove for you.
If the person holding the authority admits their ignorance, it gives the patient permission to be completely authentic. It removes the pressure to pretend everything is fine.
Precisely. And I think it is vital to emphasize a core philosophy of Morrow's work here. The goal of this dissertation and the goal of servant leadership is not to dismantle or destroy the Christ Recovery Center.
Because the CRC is a vital institution that saves lives.
The goal is to expand its rigid boundaries. The researcher insists that as leaders, we must train ourselves to look at the impact of our systems, not just the intent behind them.
That is the hardest pill for any leader to swallow. The intent of the UGMTC leadership was pure. They genuinely wanted to save lives.
But good intentions do not negate systemic inequity.
If a recovery program is intended for everyone, but the data shows it only successfully graduates white men, the impact of the program is fundamentally inequitable.
And servant leadership is the tool that forces you to measure that impact based on the experience of the least privileged person in the room, not the most comfortable.
To summarize our journey today, we started with a researcher standing in a graduation ceremony, experiencing a gnawing sense of cognitive dissonance.
We tracked that feeling into the archives, looking at 15 years of jarring demographic data.
We explore the deep, rigorous framework of servant leadership, understanding that true leadership means intentionally flattening power dynamics to serve the marginalized.
We examine the 1930s cultural origins of the AA Big Book and the exhausting reality of forcing individuals to translate a regional dialect while fighting for their lives.
We looked at the quantitative survey data that proved a 5% shift in trust can melt a rigid culture. And we listened to the devastating qualitative voices of the men who were subjected to a blind triage system.
And finally, we walk through a practical, structural blueprint for systemic change.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you walk back into your own office, or your own nonprofit, or your own community tomorrow.
We have spent this hour talking extensively about how well-meaning organizations build massive, complex programs that unintentionally favor the cultural majority.
But consider this dynamic in your own life and leadership. What happens when the very metrics you use to define success, whether that is graduation rates in addiction recovery, performance reviews in corporate America, or civic engagement in our local communities, are subtly calibrated to only measure the success of the dominant culture?
Are the people struggling in your organization actually failing, or are you just evaluating them with a ruler that was never designed to measure their greatness?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? Are we punishing people for failing to thrive in a system that was built to exclude them? We want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive today.
We encourage you to take a hard, fearless look at the triage desks and the hidden pipelines in your own organizations.
Keep asking the hard questions, and we will see you next time.